Today we are going to talk about Cambridge Analytica. Wendy Siegelman shares her work on Twitter and Medium, and is also published in The Guardian or BuzzFeed and elsewhere. Wendy is known as the Queen of Charts because not only she studies her subject in depth, but she comes up with this brilliant and very handsome, I think, and good-looking, clear and precise way of delivering the information. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Serena.
What is Cambridge Analytica? Generally, people only know that Trump's team hired Cambridge Analytica for data analysis during the presidential campaign of 2016. They also know, probably, that Cambridge Analytica then stole 200 million Facebook profiles of American users. Well, how would you describe Cambridge Analytica and SCL activities to someone who is not familiar with these companies and their activities? I want to note here that Einstein once said that if a scientist can't explain to a 3-year-old what he or she is doing, he or she doesn't know what he or she is doing. So I'm not quite sure if that really applies to Cambridge Analytica because it's a complex and arcane subject, but can we try?
We can give it a shot. It is complex, and as all the recent hearings in the UK, the US, Canada over Cambridge Analytica have shown, it's hard for people to understand, even the folks who work at Cambridge Analytica and SCL themselves. I have spent time, as you mentioned, charting out the company, looking at the company, often from the point of view of the corporate structure and all the different business entities, but I'll start trying to explain kind of what the business model is. And I think maybe the 3-year-old way of explaining it is that their company collects data from different sources, from Facebook, from other sources as well. They take all this data, they compile it, and then they apply different kinds of data science to it and different algorithms to analyze the data. Then they take the analysis of the data and they use it. So they have different companies that focus on different business areas. There's SCL Group, which is the main UK-based company. They also have SCL Elections, which is really the kind of focus point for a lot of the political discussions around the 2016 US election, as well as Brexit, although they claim they did not work with Brexit. But SCL Elections is focused on campaigns and political elections. They also have SCL Social, which does social media work. They've had SCL Defense. They have a long history, actually, of doing defense work, where a lot of their knowledge, I think of taking large data sets, analyzing them, and the analysis is really looking at trying to understand people, their motivations, their reactions, and their behavior. So it's kind of this behavioral analysis. And then to try to predict what decisions people will make, what preferences they will have. And based on that, they craft messaging. So with their social media focus, they craft social media campaigns and messages that they then deploy in political areas and elections. They also have a commercial focus. So they have SCL Commercial, where they've tried to go out and get corporate business as well, kind of like advanced advertising. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like a lot of what they do, but their corporate structure is very confusing. They have a lot of different branches and affiliates. They have their UK-based business, their US businesses, and they've had a hard time explaining how they work together. People have had a hard time understanding, and a lot of people have suspected that that may be on purpose, that it's a very complex business to understand where do the people work, where does the paycheck come from, where does the actual data reside. Right. So these are all what everyone's trying to unravel now.
Thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. People behind the company, as we know, the Mercers family and also Steve Bannon. Can you talk a little bit about the Mercers family and Bannon's role in Cambridge Analytica and SCL?
They have been very involved, especially related to the U.S. election. So SCL actually goes back early 2000s when Nigel Oakes originally set it up. So I don't know of Steve Bannon or the Mercers being involved that far back. Their involvement has been publicized over the past several years. So Steve Bannon was both on the board, and he also is known to have publicly owned shares of Cambridge Analytica that he disclosed in his financial documents when he became part of the administration. So he had between, I think it was 1 million and 5 million shares in Cambridge Analytica. The Mercers have been known as the major funders of Cambridge Analytica. The open source documentation that I have seen has really been the Mercers funding Cambridge Analytica through PAC, or Political Action Committee, payments. So they have paid money into PACs that in turn have paid Cambridge Analytica. Very recent events, though, with Cambridge Analytica shutting down and filing bankruptcy filings, have shown more documentation, most recently with Rebecca Mercer and Jennifer Mercer, two of Robert Mercer's daughters, representing the board of Cambridge Analytica and signing the bankruptcy papers for the Cambridge Analytica US companies. Mm-hmm. But Steve Bannon, ideologically, and Robert Mercer and Rebecca Mercer have been known to have been key players, along with Alexander Nix, Nigel Oakes, and Jared Kushner, and Brad Parscale, who headed up their digital media campaign.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a lot of names and a lot of information. And interestingly, these names will be coming up in some questions that we are to look at. So it all kind of ties up, but in a way that is not clear to me yet. So hopefully we'll help to shed some light on that.
It is very unclear. But one of the things that we noticed, so I had originally last year worked with excellent journalist Anne Marlowe, and together we created the SCL Cambridge Analytica chart looking at their business structure. And Anne had been working on a massive chart. I had been doing my own research. We got together and we teamed up. And one of the things that we found, which had been reported on a little bit, is that Cambridge Analytica had a U.S. office at 8383 Wilshire Boulevard in California, which is the same address and suite number where Steve Bannon has Breitbart located, Glittering Steel, several of his other businesses. So a lot of people have been just trying to kind of figure out all the connections, but that's one very clear connection as well.
Right. That kind of adds to the picture. And yes, I know that Anne did a lot of important work in this area, so maybe one day it will be good to talk to her as well and get her perspective. We know that you're the leading expert in this area, Emerdata. Can you tell us about your discovery and about this company? What caught your attention? How did you arrive to your conclusions? And as you put it in your recent article for Guardian, are Cambridge Analytica and SCL Group attempting to evade recent negative press coverage only to reform and continue their work as part of a new entity?
So my discovery of Emerdata happened last year. I was, as part of tracking all the SCL Cambridge Analytica companies, I spend a lot of time on the Companies House website, where the UK companies do all their filings, and poking around and seeing what the Cambridge Analytica folks are up to. And Julian Wheatland, who is the chairman of SCL, I had noticed late last year that he had a couple of new companies that were set up in 2017, Emerdata Limited and another one called Fanalytica, which seems to be a sports-based business that I haven't found any direct connection with Cambridge Analytica, but so I noticed Emerdata last year, and then in March, around the time that the huge story from The Guardian, The Observer, and the New York Times broke about the Cambridge Analytica harvesting data, 50 million on 50 million people through Facebook. Around that time, suddenly Emerdata seemed to percolate to life, and there were a lot of filings that came out. Mm-hmm. So some filings were posted showing that several new directors had been appointed to Emerdata. So originally it was Julian Wheatland and Alex Taylor, the chief data officer of Cambridge Analytica. So some new filings came out with new directors, and there were 3 new directors, someone named Johnson Chun Shun Ko, someone named Chung Peng, and another person named Ahmed Al-Khatib. At the time that they joined in January of 2018, there was also around 2 million pounds of shares that were issued in Emerdata. And then in March, there were some other filings that came out showing that Jennifer Mercer and Rebecca Mercer had also joined as directors. So this company was suddenly kind of filling out, taking on a lot of directors. And one of the interesting things about one of the early directors in January, Johnson Chun Chung Ko, is that he happens to be a business partner with Eric Prince in a Hong Kong-based group, Frontier Services Group. So Eric Prince is a chairman. Mr. Ko is the deputy chairman. They've worked together for several years, so that was an interesting addition to this world. And so I published an article at the end of March on this, and immediately questions started to arise around what you said. Is this kind of the new iteration and future version of Cambridge Analytica and SCL? As the story from The Guardian and the New York Times and Observer exploded, Channel 4 News published some undercover video showing how Cambridge Analytica was operating and some of the kind of dirty tricks that they were proposing. They've claimed they've never implemented, but they were proposing to a prospective customer. And Channel 4 News also interviewed Nigel Oakes, one of the founders of SCL, who said that Emerdata Limited was set up to take over all the business of Cambridge Analytica and SCL. What's very interesting is with the recent news in the past few days that Cambridge Analytica and SCL are winding down operations. Mm-hmm. They've submitted their bankruptcy filings in the U.S. and have said that they're implementing bankruptcy in the UK as well. There are a few companies that are still around and have not filed bankruptcy, and that includes Emerdata. They have a subsidiary called Firecrest Technologies that still exists. And then one SCL company is not filing bankruptcy, and that is SCL Insight Limited. And so that's kind of interesting that there is still one SCL company that is still active. And there were also reportings around the bankruptcy that several employees or former employees of Cambridge Analytica and SCL had heard about a rebranding effort earlier this year. Mm-hmm. So that rebranding effort does seem to be focused around Emerdata Limited.
I want to bring up here for some viewers who are not as familiar with the scene that Eric Prince happens to be the brother of Betsy DeVos, and Betsy DeVos is the Secretary for Education in Trump's government. Betsy DeVos family company Amway allegedly had some connections with Alpha Bank, and they definitely do business with Alpha Bank.
Another notable thing about Eric Prince, besides being the brother of Betsy DeVos, is that he is very close to California Representative Dana Rohrabacher, who is known to be very pro-Russia, pro-Putin.
Putin's favorite senator.
And Eric Prince had actually started, I believe, in the 1990s as an intern for Paul Behrens. I'm not sure if I'm saying it correctly, right. Who was Dana Rohrabacher's right-hand person for a very long time, and may still work for him. So Prince has very close ties there. Another thing that's just very interesting about Johnson Chun Chung Ho being involved with Emerdata is he was reported by Forbes as being one of the 50 wealthiest businessmen in Hong Kong. And Frontier Services Group, which he leads with Eric Prince, one of their largest, if not the largest, outside investor is CITIC, which is a Chinese state-run business. So the connection through Mr. Ko as a director of Emerdata with the Chinese government is interesting, as well as the involvement of, Cambridge Analytica executives and the Mercers.
Yeah, that kind of opens a lot of questions there on a bigger scale. If we look at the bigger picture, which I think is really important and one of the most difficult things here, how to fit in all the pieces of the puzzle, and where does China come in, where does Russia come in, and just remembering that the whole Cambridge Analytica business is just a one tiny piece in the overall picture. And I hope that one day we'll get to talk about that and expose that as well.
But it's a puzzle.
it is a puzzle, but it is a puzzle in which every detail is meaningful, and we need to be paying attention to tiny little details and be as precise as possible. And I think this is one of very many strengths that you have shown in this last year and a half or 2 years, that you can really cut through all the garbage and nail down with a great precision these details that are so important. That's why your research, I think, is so valuable. Our next question goes into this murky area where a lot of connections come together. There's a lot of misconceptions and some errors. And as I mentioned, you're very good at catching these little things that are not exactly correct. So there is an understanding in the certain circles of Twitter community that Steve Bannon and Dmitry Firtash were on the board of Cambridge Analytica. And I hope you can comment on that and bring in some clarity on this question. But before we move there, I want to also make a note and bring some clarity on Dmitry Firtash and some other oligarchs and businessmen who claim to be Ukrainian. It is really important to understand here that most of these people came of age and grew their fortunes, or at least started, during the time of the Soviet Union, the USSR, when Ukraine was just a part of the Soviet Union, just as Russia. And a lot of people who claim to be Ukrainians now are actually either not ethnically Ukrainian, they could be either Russian or Tatar or Jewish or some other ethnicity, who don't even speak Ukrainian language and just have their Ukrainian passport because they were born in the Ukrainian Soviet Republic of the Soviet Union. And they are very often, if not always, are Putin's allies, and they are from pro-Putin circles and have close ties to the other Russian oligarchs. And it is just of an advantage to them now to bring out this fake identity of being Ukrainian. There's a lot of misunderstanding there. The same is happening with Michael Cohen's, Trump's personal lawyer's family, who claim to be Ukrainian, who are actually just the former Soviet Union citizens, something to keep in mind. That having said, Firtash supposedly also has close connections to Semyon Mogilevich, who is the organized crime boss on the top of the FBI most wanted list. We also know that Paul Manafort worked for Firtash for quite a while. And coincidentally, Michael Flynn reported his paid advisory position at Cambridge Analytica. And we know that Rebecca Mercer, that you have mentioned, the daughter of Robert Mercer, picked Michael Flynn to the National Security Advisor position. So that's a lot. There's a lot of connections. Can you comment on that?
Actually, this research was broken in a story, I believe it was August 2016, so way ahead of the curve. Anne Marlowe, who I worked with on the Cambridge Analytica SCL chart, actually the reason I sought out Anne Marlowe is because of this story she wrote about Cambridge Analytica, where she did identify a connection to Dmitry Firtash. And a lot of people have kind of made mistakes about this connection down the road. But what Anne discovered was that the first largest shareholder of SCL for 10 years, from around 2005 until 2015, was Vincent Chenguez. So he was a major shareholder of SCL. He sold his shares in 2015, but Julian Wheatland, who is currently the chairman of SCL in the most senior position, worked for Vincent Chenguez at Consensus Business Group. So Anne Marlowe was doing some research, and she found that Vincent Chenguez was a shareholder in a company called Xander Group that Dmitry Firtash was also a shareholder in, and it was often through companies that they controlled. But they had a common company, Xander Group, that connected the two of them. And so this kind of raised a very, very interesting connection because, as you mentioned, Dmitry Firtash, because of his connection to Paul Manafort, who ran Trump's campaign for several months. However, there is no known connection from Dmitry Firtash directly to Cambridge Analytica and SCL at this time. But this is very intriguing. It's I saw that and basically posed the question, who really has access to our data? And that has been the question that has blown up and exploded and actually leads into all sorts of huge questions about technology companies and the way technology companies collect our data. But that's how Firtash connects in. And the question you open with, naming all these people and the Mercers and Rebecca Mercer picking Flynn. There was also an executive at Cambridge Analytica in the US who had previously worked under Michael Flynn at the DNI. So that's another interesting connection there. Mm-hmm. And another connection I just want to mention, which has been touched on, Natasha Bertrand did a piece for The Atlantic about someone named Sam Patton. Sam Patton has come out as a consultant that has worked with SCL over time. And it's very interesting because Sam Patton set up a business with Konstantin Kilimnik,
right,
who is the former GRU who worked with Paul Manafort. So there are a lot of interesting connections. Manafort to Firtash, who had done a business deal with Vincent Chenguez, who funded SCL. Manafort to Kilimnik, who set up a business with Sam Patton, who was a contractor often hired to work with Cambridge Analytica SCL.
In his excellent book, Collusion, Luke Harding dedicates like half of chapter talking about Kilimnik and his correspondence with them. And basically all signs show that Kilimnik was working for the Russian intelligence services. So there's all these connections here, which again brings another aspect as we talk about all these little things and connections. And when sort of like looking at your chart, we see all these little boxes, and there's so many. But we have to keep in mind the overall general idea that why is it all happening? There is a strategy behind it. It's not just all happening randomly, like in jungles. These are directed efforts by certain entities, and there's a certain goal there. But it's important to always remember that it is not about just random people doing random things. It's important to have the general idea of the direction.
Yes, and this is where your expertise in propaganda comes
propaganda
in.
Again is only a part of the puzzle. We are talking about hybrid war here. One of your work associates, J.J.Patrick from the UK, has written an excellent book, Alternative War, where I think he really delivers the idea very well that this is a multidimensional operation that includes propaganda aspects, weaponizing money, weaponizing information, weaponizing ideas, weaponizing people, resources, weaponizing business. And what happens with a lot of things are getting weaponized. We're in a state of war. The problem is here that only one party knows that we're in a state of war. So our adversary knows that we're in a state of war and is attacking us, meaning the United States and European Union. And the other side is kind of unaware of what's going on. So
yes. Catching up. We're catching up.
Yeah, well, hopefully we need a lot of work to do in terms of catching up. This is my take on it. Another question on the connections between Mercer, Robert Mercer, and Russian oligarchs. Since we are on the channel Russian Propaganda Explained, we always have this angle of looking at the Russian connection. It is known that Renaissance Technologies, which is Mercer's hedge fund, bought US-listed shares of Wimpelcom and Mobile Telesystems, two Russian telecommunications firms with significant operations in Russia and Ukraine. Wimpelcom, interestingly, is an affiliate of Alpha Bank, founded by the Russian oligarchs Mikhail Friedman and Peter Aven, both known to be close to Putin. Now, Wendy, you have mentioned Vincent Cenguiz, who was a former biggest shareholder of SCLP and SCL's largest shareholder from 2005 to 2015, who also invested in another Firtash-owned UK business. And it is perhaps interesting to mention here that Cenguiz's address is shared with Mikhail Friedman's Letter 1 in London. The address is 35 Park Lane, and Friedman happens to be a co-founder and partner in Alpha Access Renova, along with Victor Vekselberg. We know from the development of the last couple of weeks, or even a month, that Vekselberg has alleged ties with Michael Cohen, paying Michael Cohen's company. And Michael Cohen, if you have missed it, is the personal lawyer of Donald Trump. And we also know that Vekselberg is involved with Wilbur Ross in the Bank of Cyprus. And the Bank of Cyprus is very close to the Russian government and to the laundered money of the Russian oligarchs. Another connection here is Mercers and Dmitry Rybolovlev's yachts have been seen in communications in the British Virgin Islands. And Dmitry Rybolovlev is known to, at some point, having bought, I forgot the sum, you might remember that, 95 million, I believe.
95 million. He paid 95 million on a house that was worth around $50 million less when Donald Trump bought it. So he paid about 50 million more.
Right, exactly. So that same Dmitry Rybolovlev owned shares in the Bank of Cyprus that is partially owned by Trump's Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross. The Bank of Cyprus is known, as I have mentioned, to have ties to Putin. And one last connection here is that Mr. Cattell, Rybolovlev's spokesman, used to write for Mercer-owned Breitbart. So as you can see, there's like all these people coming together one way or another. And when you think about it, like for our viewers, for people in the audience, do you happen to know that many Russian oligarchs? Do you have to know that many government officials who are very close to some people close to the Kremlin? It just doesn't happen naturally, not to the people I know. So Wendy, what do you think about it?
It's quite remarkable, as you said, and it's something that all of us who have been citizen journalists, investigators, looking at this right after the election, and many looking at it way before the election, have been saying, how is this all happening? And Trump, meanwhile, has been out on the road saying, I have no connection to Russia. I know no Russians. I don't speak to them ever. But many of the connections you talked about, one writer who's done some excellent work on this is Jim Henry, who discovered that story about Rybolovlev's purchase of the house that infused Trump with a $50 million profit, which is quite amazing. I think I'm with you, and I'm with the general public that is following the Trump-Russia story, that it seems like a lot more than coincidental, and There are also many stories of the Trump family talking about all of their money, Donald Trump Jr., that they depend on money from Russians. There's evidence of all the Russian money that's gone into real estate in Trump properties in Florida, in the Little Moscow area, Sunny Isles, and so on. So it feels like there's a lot there. And one thing that's interesting as a researcher and journalist working on this is the importance, as you said, of really focusing on facts. So it's always finding a balance between trying to report out very factual information and not make assumptions. But I do think it's also very important to have theories that help guide you in terms of where you investigate and where you dig and where you look. And I think that's why there are so many conspiracy theories that kind of get generated. Theories can be very healthy and very good, but not when they're presented as fact. So it's important to only present facts, but keep theories to kind of guide where you dig and where you investigate further. And as you said, we're putting together these pieces of the puzzle, and sometimes you have to kind of ask very murky questions, and then you say, okay, now I have to go out and find the actual data that supports it. If I don't find it, it's not there. If I find something, that I can report on.
I completely agree with you. I think it's really important. It's very tempting to jump into some conclusion when you see something that is coming together, to say like, aha, I found it, I got it, like now it's all clear, and kind of like having this Sherlock Holmes moment. But it's very important to keep the discipline. And I always go as a writer, I'm always guided by Scott Fitzgerald's quote that you have to have the richness of imagination and at the same time to keep the discipline in order to write a novel. I think it's kind of the same here. You have to keep your imagination, because Molly McHugh said that our imagination has failed us to recognize that we're in a state of hybrid war. So imagination is important, but it's really important to keep this imagination at bay and kind of verify everything with a fact, with at least two sources, and not get carried away with exciting theories. So I think that right. You and people like Anne Marlowe are doing a great job by providing this data and the facts that are verified and precise, and that nobody can say, aha, that's another conspiracy theory. It is not, because the facts are there. And I think another way for me to go is by questions. Always ask the questions, see things for what they are. And even if you don't have the answer right away, that's okay. The question eventually will come to something, if not to an answer, but to something else, or something that you're not looking for. This is a connection that I believe has not been explored yet. At least I haven't seen the information on that, and not in the mainstream media, not in the Twitter community. That's the question of LUKOIL. LUKOIL is the second largest private oil company in Russia, and it is known to be close to the Kremlin. Its CEO, Vagit Alekperov, goes long way with Putin, all the way back to the then Leningrad of the late 80s, early 90s. And in an interesting way, LUKOIL, an oil company, has been involved with Cambridge Analytica, which is a psychological operation and hybrid war company, in 2015 and 16, which is quite surprising because the connection is not immediately accessible, right? So LUKOIL managers were interested in the targeting techniques and other strategic decisions of Cambridge Analytica, and were sitting in on some of the meetings. For example, presentation on micro-targeting and the campaign to demoralize and disinform voters in Nigeria was delivered to Vagit Alekperov, like I said, a CEO and a former Soviet oil minister and a close ally of Putin. In 1997, Donald Trump was planning to use his receptionist at Trump Organization, a native Russian speaker called Inga Bogutska, as an interpreter during his meeting with the Russian General Alexander Levitt. And strangely enough, these two facts from a long time ago, 1997, and LUKOIL talking to Cambridge Analytica come together. I came across the name of Inga Bogutska in the New Yorker story on Donald Trump meeting Alexander Lebed in 1997. And there is mention of Inga Bogutska, who had a father who, by coincidence, was a Russian general. That kind of caught my eye. I followed up. I wasn't able to find any general called Bogutsky. However, Inga Bogutska's further career is remarkable in the context of this talk. After working for Trump's organization from 1996 to 2001, so for quite a while, she moved on to Millennium Partners, a company with the UK HQ office located at 50 Berkeley Street, London. And that office shares office space with Glencore, a company that bought 50% of Rosneft shares in a non-transparent deal that might have benefited Trump. Okay, that, you say, could be a complete coincidence. Let's take a closer look here. Millennium Partners HQ in New York is 666 Fifth Avenue, Jared Kushner's property. So the office of Millennium Company, at which Inga Bogutska is working now, located at Jared Kushner's property. Millennium Partners CEO Israel Englander has multiple ties with Jared Kushner. Kushner actually used to date Englander's daughter at some point. Now, Englander is reportedly an expert on shell account deals. And here it brings us to Cambridge Analytica and this complicated structure that you were talking about in the beginning of the interview. Furthermore, Rob Newton, a chief information officer at Millennium Capital Europe from 2015 to 2017, used to be the managing director of Vnestor Bank in 2011 and 2014. And for those who are blissfully unaware, Vnestor Bank provided the bridge loan for Rosneft sale, and of course it's a state bank of Russia, sometimes named as Putin's bank. Another coincidence that now, since 2010 up till now, Inga Bogutska works for LUKOIL. And the CEO of LUKOIL, as we have mentioned in the beginning of this little trip, is Vagit Alekperov, Putin's ally. So this is quite a trajectory here, right? Trump, LUKOIL, an oil company interested in psychological warfare and close to the Kremlin, and then a quick stop at a company connected to the Russian main state bank, and then Trump's son-in-law, and then all the way to LUKOIL. What do you make of that?
I think it's fascinating. As you said, reporters, the Twitter sphere, have followed the LUKOIL story when it came out through Christopher Wiley that Cambridge Analytica had presented in a few different ways to LUKOIL. But this connection that you have identified with this woman who worked at the Trump Organization, who worked at Israel Englander's firm, and then went on to LUKOIL is very interesting, and exactly the kind of noticing of connecting of the dots that warrants further research to understand what's really happening.
Yeah, and again, this is a very good example how important it is not to jump to any conclusions. I am not making any conclusions based on that. All I have is a number of questions, and I would be probably interested to see some answers or look into some sources, look some further into that, and we might find out something interesting, or we might never find out why this perhaps totally innocent of any schemes lady had such an interesting career. That's also possible. Until we have all the facts, we cannot come to any conclusions.
This is true.
Here's a very brief question for you, which also perhaps opens another door and brings other questions with it. I'm not very familiar with the whole link of events here, but it's known that Alexander Kogan, who was working for Cambridge Analytica, simultaneously was invited to St. Petersburg State University giving lectures on the communications and the psychological operation as a I believe as a modern warfare or something to that extent. What is known that he was giving lectures in Russia on the invitation of the psychology department of St. Petersburg State University. I had the misfortune or the advantage of studying at this university, St. Petersburg State University at the time when I was there, Leningrad State University, which is an excellent school, and I got an good education in philology. However, on top of philology, the course of compulsory combat or spec propaganda was imposed on me and my fellow students. The list sadly includes people like Putin, Medvedev, Sechin, Dmitry Kiselyov, the voice of Kremlin, Olgina trolls, and the list can go on for a long time. All these people studied there at different times, but knowing the way things go there and seeing the results, I don't think much has changed from the time when I was taking my combat propaganda course, when we were writing leaflets, American soldiers surrender, you're surrounded, the fight is futile, and so on and so forth. And the fact that the Cambridge Analytica employee was lecturing or doing research there is interesting. Do you have any comment on that?
It's very, very interesting. He wasn't, I think, technically an employee. He was hired by Cambridge Analytica when he worked for a company, GSR, I believe, to collect the Facebook data. So I think the timing of it, that he was getting all this data that he was providing to Cambridge Analytica, at the same time he had this connection with St. Petersburg University, is very, very interesting. He has, in his appearances in the UK before the parliamentary committees and in his interviews, Alexander Kogan, who has renamed himself Alexander Spector, he's done a very good job minimizing his role and brushing off what he did. And he basically has said everyone was doing it. All the apps were collecting data. I disclosed in my terms of service that I was going to use the data the way I did. However, the facts definitely should be investigated. Another interesting thing about Kogan, renamed Spector, is that he has a company now called Philometrics. And when Facebook announced that they were kicking off Cambridge Analytica, they were kicking off Kogan and his company, I don't know if that applied to his current company. So I don't know if other business partners, other people that are working with him, are still kind of looking at what data he collected. And on top of what data he collected, many people have pointed out it's not just the data, it's the algorithms, it's the analysis and the tools that are applied to that data. So where was it shared? And it kind of goes back to the question I mentioned that Anne Marlowe wrote about in 2016 when she covered Cambridge Analytica, and she asked, who is accessing our data? So I think Kogan was in a very unusual position, having that direct connection to Russia at the time. That should be looked at further.
I agree, wholeheartedly agree. That should be looked into further. So this is quite a trip overall. And for those of you who were able to stay with us until now, thank you very much for your attention. You're welcome to contact me at the Russian Propaganda Explained YouTube channel and Facebook page. So please follow us, stay with us. If you have something interesting to say, contact us. And we hope to find answers to the riddles. Thank you very much, Wendy.
Oh, thank you, Zarina. It's very enlightening, and I appreciate all the work that you have, the research you have done as well.